everyone. Welcome to the Center for the Study of World Religions and to our second faculty book event of the year. My name is Charles Stang. I am the new director of the center. I think I can still say I'm new. I still feel very much new. This popular series was instituted by my predecessor, Frank Clooney, as an opportunity for the HDS community to gather not only to celebrate faculty publications, but more importantly to learn from them, to engage with them, both appreciatively and critically. And to that end, we're very grateful for our two faculty respondents, both local, whose comments will kick off what I'm sure will be a spirited conversation. But before I introduce our two respondents, let me briefly introduce our author. I should say that I favor brief introductions so that our time together is spent learning from these three fine scholars rather than learning about them from me. My job is made easier by the fact that, although this is a cliche, our author needs no introduction. David Hempton is the Alonzo L. McDonald Family Professor of Evangelical Theological Studies, John Lord O'Brien Professor of Divinity and Dean of Harvard Divinity School. He has research and teaching interests in religion and popular culture, religious identities and ethnic conflicts, the interdisciplinary study of lived religion, the history and theology of evangelical Protestantism and Pentecostalism, the global history of Christianity since 1500, and religious disenchantment and secularization. He has publications to prove it, which I won't list now. We're here tonight to celebrate, to celebrate this most recent publication, Secularization and Religious Innovation in the North Atlantic World, a book edited by Dean Hempton and his colleague Hugh MacLeod. So we have two respondents, as I said. I'd like to introduce now Heather Curtis, is no stranger here, an alumna of Harvard. Heather and I both are graced with the highly sought after THD degree, which I'm hoping at some point will be so vintage as to be hip. Will be the first hip thing I can be associated with. But she is now the associate professor in the Department of Religion at Tufts University, and her current research project, Holy Humanitarians, American Evangelicals, and Global Aid, examines the crucial role evangelical missions and popular religious media played in the extension of U.S. aid from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century. And that book is forthcoming from Harvard University Press very soon. When? April. Mark your calendars. John Roberts is the Tomorrow Foundation Professor of American Intellectual History at Boston University. That might be the best title I have ever heard, the Tomorrow Foundation Professor. I feel very much like I'm the Yesterday Foundation Professor of all things ancient. Never mind that. Okay, Professor Roberts' research interests center on the history of Anglo-American religious thought and the history of the relationship between science and religion in Europe and North America. He is currently at work on a book tentatively entitled The Science of the Soul, American Protestant Thinkers and the Sanctity of the Mind from 1607 to 1940. So here's how this evening will unfold for those of you who are new to our faculty book series. Dean Hempton will say a few words about his book, then Professors Curtis and Roberts, who will respond in turn. We'll then bring three chairs up to the front of the room. Dean Hempton will have a chance to respond to the respondents, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. Dean Hempton has another event across the street at 7, so we have promised that we will release him in due time that he can catch his breath and cross the street. So I would only ask that you keep your questions and comments brief so that we can have as many of them as possible. So without further ado, Dean Hempton.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks especially to John and Heather for giving up better parts of their lives to read this book and to give up an evening to come and speak about it. I'm really grateful to both of you. Thanks to everyone at the center who's helped put this event on. So thanks to everyone for coming. I want to especially call out some of the other authors of this book, people who made contributions to it. Anne Brady over there, David Holland, Kip Richardson, I noticed earlier, hiding in the back, Heather Curtis herself, and is Eric Baldwin in the room? He's not. Anyway, there's a considerable Harvard contribution to this. So tonight I want to answer 4 questions. First, how did this book come to be written? All books have a biography, so what is the biography of this book? Second, why is the book organized the way it is? Third, what was surprising or especially revealing about it? And fourth, what conclusions did the editors come to? It's a little complicated because we actually disagreed about them. But before I get to those questions, I'd like to say something about the book jacket, which is, you probably all know, is a painting by Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh as it is. So I'm just going to call Vincent for now, because there's no agreement across the Atlantic on how to pronounce his name. So this is the third and best known of Vincent's religious trilogy, painted at Noonan in the 1880s, and it's called Still Life with Bible. It has a disarmingly simple composition: an open Bible, a modern novel, an extinguished candle, and a flowing tablecloth. But the painting is redolent with more profound thoughts and meanings. The Bible belonged to Vincent's father, and lies open, who was a pastor, a Dutch Reformed pastor, and lies open at chapter 53 of the book of Isaiah, the passage about the suffering servant, which Christians see as prefiguring the life and death of Christ. This is the chapter about man acquainted with sorrows and grief, despised and rejected by men, and so on. Vincent had a particular love of that chapter, which is itself kind of revealing. Like many artists and intellectuals of the later 19th century, Vincent had come to have ambivalent views about the Bible. On the one hand, he regarded it as gloomy and parochial, but he also admired its grandeur and longevity. He remained intrigued by the person of Jesus. Jesus, he wrote, quote, was the only solace in the otherwise so dispiriting Bible, which pains and perplexes us so deeply with its narrow-mindedness and contagious stupidity. The consolation, like a pit surrounded by a hard rind and bitter fruit, that is Christ. So Van Gogh's simultaneous rejection of the Bible's bitter fruit and his fascination with the man of sorrows acquainted with grief pointed not only to an inner tension, but also to a kind of generational religious war with his father, who was very disturbed by his son's growing infidelity. Vincent, as you know, a little bit part of his life, that he was a theological student at the University of Amsterdam, but flunked out of it really because he didn't want to deal with the languages, and he'd come to hate his professors. Actually, he thought people who taught in theological schools were a particularly disreputable group of people, and he became a missionary to the Belgian miners, and also a Methodist lay preacher for a while. But anyway, so the one part of this is the Bible. In Van Gogh's Still Life Open Bible, it's deliberately juxtaposed with a copy of Émile Zola's recently published novel La Joie de Vivre, which was published in 1884. Vincent later told his sister that he read Rabelais and Voltaire for laughs, while he read Zola to satisfy his need, quote, for being told the truth, or life as it is. Hence, the juxtaposition of the Bible with Zola's novel may not be as straightforward a contrast between biblical melancholia and modernist liberation as it first appears, but may also be the reverse. The suffering servant is, after all, as much a tale of redemption as it is of suffering. And Zola's novel, despite its title, is a cold-eyed treatment of the human condition in all its complex realism. Put another way, Vincent admired the Bible for its lofty ideals and its connections with the past and the future, while Zola brought him face to face with the present, the only time, quote, that human beings can directly take action and alter their condition. It is also possible to see a connection between Isaiah's suffering servant and Pauline Quenu, the most admirable character in Zola's novel, who, despite being an orphan and abused by everyone around her, emerges as a redemptive figure, the incarnation of renunciation, of love for others, and kindly charity for an erring humanity. In short, Vincent's still life painting is not so much a contrast between a gloomy Bible and the modern joy of life, as it is an expression of his frequently articulated view that it was the responsibility of artists and writers to express the truth of life for their own generation. In that sense, the Bible was not redundant, it was simply not enough. So this painting, though it looks dark and static to the untutored eye, was painted in one rush during a single day and is really a riot of free brushstrokes and experiments with new colors. It's also a recognition that modernity in the shape of Zola's naturalism was a necessary condition, a necessary addition to the old beauty of the scriptures, which could never again be taken at face value by a new generation of critical Europeans. The extinguished candle in this painting, whether intentionally situated or not, and I think it's intentionally situated, rests beside the open Bible, not Zola's joie de vivre. So it's a very interesting painting and does make, I think, a nice book jacket. Anyway, back to the 4 questions, and I'll be pretty brief on these. How did this book come to be written? What is its biography? Really, it comes out of a decision I made when I decided to become Dean of Harvard Divinity School and had a desire to keep an intellectual life alive, if possible. I'd finished a couple of books just before becoming Dean, but I knew I could not write another research-based book while I was Dean. That was wise. I also did not want to be a dean removed from the world of scholarship and to be so out of sympathy with faculty concerns that they could simply point at me as someone who simply didn't understand anymore what it was like to be a faculty member, doing things, writing, teaching, all those crazy things. So hence the idea, I knew I couldn't write another book while being dean, but I did want to do something. So the idea of an edited collection came out right there. And the theme of secularization is one that I had gone back to various times in between writing books, especially since Hugh MacLeod and I used to partner in these conferences in these wonderful European cities, Madrid, Paris, and Amsterdam. And the books that came out of these conferences, which are all here, I mean, European Religion, the Age of Great Cities, the Decline of Christendom in Western Europe, and Secularization in the Christian World, all came out of those conferences over a period of years. So secularization seemed to be the obvious thing. Then came this wonderful invitation from the Radcliffe Institute to apply for one of their seminars where they will pay for 20 scholars to come together and talk about things in the Radcliffe Institute, and they pay for it, which is wonderful. So I made a proposal and it was accepted, and Liz Cohen, the wonderful Dean of Radcliffe, who's now retiring, hosted us for a conference. And the idea was to bring Harvard into conversation with European scholars and for older established scholars to come into conversation with younger ones. That's what these seminars are designed to do. So it's a way of building links between Harvard and the wider world and between older has-beens like me and younger scholars like Heather and Kip, who were doing really dynamic new work. We chose the North Atlantic world as our region, more particularly the US and Western Europe, as the basis of comparison. But we knew very well that there are multiple regions within each entity in those places. These are big areas. And we also knew that the North Atlantic world is not the whole world, just the part we happen to know most about. So we're aware that this is not a book about secularization of everywhere. It's the North Atlantic region. And we're well aware that Ireland and England and France and Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands and parts of the United States, different regions, have different religious characteristics. But we still thought it was worth doing it as a broad, like Van Gogh's broad brushes. So we held the conference and a number of themes started to emerge, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But then we got a little lucky with a significant grant to host another conference at Harvard with a view to publishing a book. And the condition of the grant, however, was to deal with the theme of religious innovation. which at first we resisted because we kind of thought, what is religious innovation? Why would you think about that? But it actually turned out to be a creative and revealing theme. So in a way we were dragooned into this theme, but it turned out to be an inspired choice. And this leads me to my second question. Why is the book organized the way it is? Forget this. So from the Radcliffe Conference, we identified 8 major themes that would benefit from further analysis. And the idea was to bring an Americanist and a Europeanist into conversation with one another and with a given theme. We wanted as many essays as possible to be comparative, but to be honest, we found it difficult to find scholars equally at home in the histories of Western Europe and the United States. So the themes we chose were church, state, and money, and especially thinking about the separation of church and state and in the American Revolution and thereafter. Gender and voluntary, so church, state, and money, evangelicalism, which is a big feature of the American religious landscape, born in America or new religious movements, gender and voluntary associations, popular culture, and we chose Pentecostalism and sport, war, the Cold War and revivalism, getting us into what happens to religion during periods of warfare, Roman Catholicism in the era of Vatican II, and then the 1960s and 70s with the rise of megachurches and the Christian right in the United States, and then with 2 concluding chapters from the editors. Of course, we could have chosen any number of other themes, but these were the 8 we started with, and we only had a word limit of 160,000 words, so we had to stop somewhere. Above all, we wanted to test some well-rehearsed chestnuts about secularization in the West, sometimes based on the thinnest evidence to see if they held up under some kind of serious historical scrutiny and some kind of comparative treatment. So for those of you not familiar with this literature, I should say just a few words about how interpretations have shifted in the past 30 years or so. Peter Berger's sacred canopy argument, which has been followed on in books like Brad Gregory's book on the unintended Reformation, really argues that the greater pluralization of religion is a midwife to secularization because the sacred canopy begins to be dismantled and there's less of a clarity about religious truth claims and so on. So operating within that tradition, secularization was regarded as almost almost an inevitable pattern of what would happen in the West. Complex changes associated with modernity, urbanization, pluralization, scientific knowledge were making and would make religion more private, more marginal, and less socially salient. Now, that interpretation seemed not to fit the United States as it fitted Western Europe. So there was always some unease about it right from the start. And so that interpretation gradually shifted to the position that religion was thriving throughout the world with the exception of Western Europe, which is somehow exceptional. That's the one that needs to be explained. So over this 30 years, we moved from a kind of American exceptionalism, how could an advanced technological society still be so religious, to an European exceptionalism. Why is the rest of the world so religious, but Western Europe is the odd one out? Third question, what was surprising or especially revealing? The first surprise was how little interchange there is between American and European historians of religion in the period after the American Revolution. Historians tend to organize themselves according to national traditions. So there are, conferences of Irish historians and German historians and French historians and American historians. They often never meet. So it's actually quite rare now to find anyone with a real competency in both European and American history, which is a shame. The second is that most Western European historians, influenced by the Annales School in France and the History Workshop movement in England, out of which came the Past and Present, that famous publication, so that most European historians come at these questions from the perspective of social history and empiricism, whereas many, perhaps even most American historians of religion are primarily cultural historians, sometimes with strongly theoretical inclinations. The third surprising thing is just, or revealing thing, is just how complicated this subject is and how the well-known tropes for organizing our thinking are really dangerously untested with hard evidence. So it was a little bit of an act of demolition, the book. And fourth, the theme of innovation turned out to be particularly interesting, even in terms of where new religious movements were being born. Up to 1800, most new religious movements in the West originated in Europe. After 1800, most new religious movements in the West originated in the United States. That itself is an interesting phenomenon, which requires some explanation, which I don't have an answer to. So my fourth question is, what conclusions did the editors reach? Well, the nasty little secret is that Hugh and I do not entirely agree on the conclusions, Hugh MacLeod and I, albeit in a spirit of friendly engagement, which is what was wonderful about this project. The roots of the disagreement, and this is a mild disagreement, I mean, we agree on most of this, but the roots of our disagreement are that Hugh MacLeod sees the secularization trajectories of Western Europe and the United States as really quite similar, apart from particular decades where some separation takes place. In other words, there are particular decades where there's like a cliff-like change happens, the 1790s and 1960s. He also thinks, and I don't disagree with this, that secularization is not a very helpful word for what is happening. He prefers pluralization and change over time over any kind of declension narrative. I find, as an alternative to that, more persuasive the idea that the roots of the different religious trajectories of these two regions go back quite a long way, back to the late 18th century. So I like Charles Taylor's idea of accumulated small differences over time, which produce different patterns. For example, although Methodism as a religious movement was started in England, its real mega growth came in the United States, and it had a much more revivalistic style than the British version. The same is true of premillennial dispensationalism and fundamentalism. This is the theological category that underpins American fundamentalism, which is a stunningly successful tradition. That religious tradition was birthed in Ireland. Dispensational premillennialism was formulated in Ireland in the 1810s and 20s. But its real cultural impact came in the United States. There are not hardly any classic fundamentalists left in Ireland, whereas there are millions in the United States. Hence, I organized my chapter, and I don't want to say much about this, around longer-term structural differences. The separation of church and state, I think, is really important. Religion and the national project is really important. My argument is that religious traditions do better when they're in sync with the national project, and don't do so well when they're against the national project. And I can say more about that. Immigration is a big shaper of American religion, and a big reason why American religion is often organized around immigrant communities. I also wrote about media and popular culture. There's a way in which American religion is disseminated into popular culture more vigorously, I think, than is true of Europe, though I'd like to refine that a little bit. The Enlightenment plays out differently in both places. The Enlightenment narrative in Europe is about rationalism, especially France. The Enlightenment project in the United States is more around liberty and freedom, and that's a very different construct. I also took the opportunity to flag some issues that we need to know a lot more about, and we should know a lot more about, but we don't. These are obvious issues like fertility rates. I think fertility rates would be, we all know now that the demographics of world religious traditions are changing dramatically because of differential fertility rates. That's also true in 18th, 19th, 20th century West. Fertility rates are much higher in the United States than they are in Western Europe. And among conservative religious groups, they're higher even still. So the transmission through fertility into the next generation, that's a big, that's something to pay attention to. Similarly, intermarriage and generational transmission. How does religion get transmitted intergenerationally? There's a lot of evidence now to suggest that once you get into intermarriage between different religious traditions, generational transmission starts to weaken. And over time, lower fertility rates, lower generational transmission rates begin to have a big impact on religious trajectories. We know very little about this still. We still know not as much as we need to know about the financing of religious institutions. It does seem clear that America American religious institutions are more flexibly funded than Western European ones, which carry with them the baggage of these long, these ancient parishes. 20% of churches in England, for example, that are still functioning were built before 1300. It's not the same as the United States. So while admitting those disagreements, there's a good deal more about what we agreed on. First, secularization is a complicated word, as is religion itself. So pluralism across the West is a very important concept. Second, it's too easy to exaggerate the irreligiosity of Western Europe and the religiosity of the United States. Polling data is especially unreliable. Americans notoriously exaggerate their religiosity in polls. Go figure. Third, a great deal of the differences in religious culture in Europe and the United States flows from the separation of church and state, the democratization of American religion, and the availability of new land not parceled out in ecclesiastical parishes like Western European Christendom. So I'm going to leave it there. I think I've said more than enough. Those are the 4 questions that how the book got to be the way it is, and now other people will be able to tell you about what it's really about. Thank you very much.
So I want to begin by thanking Charles Stang for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I'm also grateful to Ariella Ruth Goldberg and others here who helped bring this planning into being. And I'm especially grateful to David Hempton for taking on this compelling, complicated, collaborative project in the first place, for offering me an opportunity to participate in the conversations that led to this volume, and for requesting that I come tonight to share some reflections about the making and the meaning of this book. My debt to David Hempton, in fact, extends far beyond this particular project on comparative secularization. So tonight is the 3rd time I've had the privilege of commenting on David's work. 12 years ago, when I was a graduate student and regular participant in the North American Religions Colloquium here at Harvard Div School, I was asked to kick off a discussion of David's monumental study, Methodism, Empire of the Spirit, published in 2005. And then in 2012, Frank Clooney invited me to this gathering at the CSWR to serve as a respondent to David's next publication, The Church in the Long 18th Century. So as I began to prepare my remarks for tonight, I considered how these previous opportunities to engage with David Hempton's influential contributions to the field of transnational religious history might serve as an entry point for reflecting on his most recent study. Tracing the trajectory of David's thinking about the development of Christianity as a global tradition places this new project on comparative secularization in its broader perspective. So during our time together, I want to highlight several key themes and concerns that have animated David's work over the past several decades, and then in so doing pose a number of questions for discussion that I hope will further the conversations that he has initiated and advanced during this transitional period in the study of religion. So let me start with Methodism, Empire of the Spirit. In this ambitious work, David argued that Methodism is a transnational religious movement that cannot be confined to or adequately interpreted within national political boundaries. Now, in 2017, this does not strike us as a particularly novel claim, but that is a measure of how far the field of religious history has shifted over the past several decades, a shift that David helped to inaugurate. When Empire of the Spirit appeared in 2005 during my final semester of graduate school, the transnational turn had really just begun to generate excitement among my cohort. We had all learned from teachers like David Hall, Bill Hutchison, and others about the importance of situating studies of American religion within a wider transnational context. Volumes like Thomas Bender's 2002 Rethinking American History in a Global Age, and essays like Shelley Fisher Fishkin's Crossroads of Cultures, The Transnational Turn in American Studies, which was the title of her presidential address to the ASA in 2004, encouraged us to move beyond conventional boundaries and particularly the borders of the nation state, which you actually just heard David articulate, are still so powerful in our conceiving our research agendas. But at that moment in 2005, David's book provided us with a compelling model for thinking globally, for expanding our parochial horizons. And it wasn't just his insistence on the trans or multinational character of Methodism that captured our attention. It was his methodological dexterity in marrying this expansive transnational scope with focused, incisive case studies of how Methodism developed, expanded, and declined in very particular social, historical, and cultural milieus. Through this approach, David argued that it was possible to identify a Methodist essence, to distinguish Methodism as a recognizable phenomena, while simultaneously maintaining that Methodism changed and adapted to new circumstances. So for students whose training told us to be suspicious of synthetic histories or, heaven forbid, meta-narratives, Empire of the Spirit offered an example of how to weave together broad claims about the global history of a religious tradition without losing sight of the complexity and diversity afforded through the study of lived religion. To accomplish this task, David adeptly employed a variety of interpretive frameworks, drawing, for example, on both the explanatory power of Marxist interpretations, which he described as both illuminating and far too simplistic, as well as local or micro-historical approaches, which he saw as compelling in and of themselves, but in some ways unsatisfying because of their limited focus. Attention to intellectual history, theological developments, social history, feminist critiques, and mentality, to name just a few more methodologies, enabled David to provide a fuller, richer, more nuanced picture of Methodism's essence in its entirety, while simultaneously highlighting the movement's many and diverse particularities. The strategy David employed in Methodism, Empire of the Spirit, telling a cohesive story about a religious movement that exceeded geographical and other sorts of sociocultural boundaries through a multiplicity of theoretical lenses, also served him well in his next major project, The Church in the Long 18th Century, another groundbreaking study that pushed past prevailing biases in religious history. By attempting to tell what the book jacket summary called a truly global story of the history of worldwide Christianity, this study strove to challenge what David called customary assumptions that Christianity is a Western or even a Western European religion, as well as the long-standing tendency to, quote, conflate European Christendom with the full extent of world Christianity. Again, David employed a variety of interpretive frameworks in his attempt to expose what he called the sheer complexity of religious and cultural encounter between Europeans and the native peoples they sought to convert. Readers of this work also wrestle with the implications of Marxist, post-colonial, and feminist theory for the study of global Christianity, while gleaning insights from the disciplines of missiology, intellectual history, linguistics, and anthropology. No single one of these approaches, David argued, sufficiently captures the intricacies or ambiguities of cultural encounter, especially since yet neither European nor native cultures were fixed or static. But together, these approaches enable us to see connections, confluences, and contest that more narrowly focused histories had overlooked or obscured. So by now, I imagine you're saying to yourselves, weren't you invited here to talk about Dean Hempton's most recent book? So I've taken the time to discuss Empire of the Spirit and Christianity in the long 18th century because I believe these previous works reveal patterns of inquiry that shaped the making of secularization and religious innovation in the North Atlantic world, and that recognizing these patterns can give us a better understanding of this new study's significance. Like both of his earlier books, Secularization and Religious Innovation reflect David's concern to broaden scholarly analysis of Christianity by placing this tradition in a wider transnational or global frame. Through this latest work, David continues to challenge students of Christianity and of American religion specifically to question and revise inherited assumptions that have structured, indeed limited, both our interpretations of the past and our hypotheses about the present. And as in both of David's aforementioned studies, this new book employs a wide range of methodologies and multidisciplinary perspectives to shift the analytical lens and shed new light on historical and current realities. The conventional wisdom that David and his collaborators seek to interrogate in this volume is the widely held supposition, indeed co-editor Hugh McLeod calls it a cliché, that there is a God gap between a more religious United States and a more secular Europe. For many proponents of this view, both defenders of the influential secularization thesis and their critics in the rational choice school of sociology, the apparent religious differences can best be explained by appealing to American exceptionalism, the longstanding belief that the United States is an anomaly, a, quote, fundamentally different kind of society from Western Europe. Often, American exceptionalism is attributed to separation of church and state and the concomitant emergence of a religious free market in the United States. Proponents of this view, and indeed scholars on all sides of the secularization debate, McLeod observes in the introduction, quote, have frequently assumed that the differences observable in the early 21st century have deep historical roots. But there has been little comparative historical research on the differences or similarities between American and European religion. So by bringing together a diverse group of scholars, historians, but also sociologists, who employ a variety of interpretive frameworks for comparison, including statistical analysis, gender theory, cultural history, and social history, Hempton and McLeod challenge the presumed distinctiveness and dominance of American religion. The collaborators ask, are there real differences between Europe and the USA? If so, how far back can they be traced? How can transnational histories of church-state structures, but also of innovative movements such as Evangelical Protestantism or Mormonism or women's voluntary associations, appropriations of popular culture, and responses to global events like the World Wars, Vatican II, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, how can comparing these things help us move beyond the binaries that have structured so much of the debate about comparative secularization in Europe and the United States? In the end, both Hempton and McLeod conclude that this collection of essays should lead us to reject, quote, claims that there is an American exceptionalism, or that there is any straightforward contrast between a religious America and a secular Europe. They agree that there are some important differences in patterns of religiosity that have accumulated since the 18th century. You just heard David talk about that. And then McLeod's point that those have accelerated, especially since the 1970s. But they insist that these comparative distinctives have emerged over time, that they are not uniform across diverse regions of Europe or the United States, and that they cannot, therefore, be attributed to an essentialist or ahistorical American uniqueness. By paying close attention to both religious differences as they have developed in precise historical periods, but also to similarities that span geographical, social, and temporal divides, McLeod argues, quote, it is possible to write a common religious history of the North Atlantic world from the 18th century to the present, to create an alternative narrative, a big story that takes account of complexity, diversity, and change over time. Here's a pattern that we've been tracing in David's work, right? Big story, but also precise analysis of empirical data. So this leads me to ask David then, what comes next? How can we as scholars of religion continue to employ global frames and interdisciplinary methods to challenge the interpretive assumptions that have limited our understanding of American religious history, the history of Christianity, the processes of secularization in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. So perhaps this might be one fruitful line of questioning for us to pursue tonight. We could begin by noting that secularization and religious innovation is limited by its focus on Christianity. MacLeod acknowledges in the introduction that the volume, quote, will not attempt to examine all of the major American and European religions, among which Judaism and Islam continue to be especially significant. Although circumscribing the study in this way makes good sense, given the expertise of the editors and the collaborators they chose, I wonder whether David or any of us in the room would advocate for taking on a broader comparison among a more diverse range of groups or not. Whether or not such a project would be feasible or wise, I do think it's necessary to draw attention to the slippage that occurs in this volume, which identifies its subject as Christianity in the introduction, but often employs the more general term religion to describe the undertaking. As when, for example, MacLeod claims that, quote, it is possible to write a common religious history of the Atlantic world without talking about Judaism or Islam. So I worry about this conflation. Is it really possible to write such a common history? Perhaps we would conclude that such a narrative is possible given the dominance of Christianity in American and European society through the 1960s. But surely moving forward, scholars will need to do more to account for the increasing diversification of religious populations in both regions. If a global history of religion, or even a more inclusive history of comparative secularization that considers a wide range of traditions seems too daunting, we might also consider other ways of building on the work of David's recent book. In their concluding essays, Hempton and MacLeod both take up the important themes of regionalism, immigration, race, ethnicity, and nationalism. Here, MacLeod uses the word tribalism as key factors in shaping patterns of religiosity in the United States and Western Europe. Yet none of the essays in the volume itself address these themes in depth. My own contribution on evangelical media does attribute the ongoing vitality of evangelicalism in the United States in part to the ways many participants embraced and advanced the myth of a Christian America, but certainly much more could be said on this subject. So I would love to see another volume of essays, volume 2 with a chapter on the religion of the lost cause among white Southerners that's mentioned in the concluding chapters. Certainly a tradition that has retained vitality by promoting a certain vision of nationalism. A sequel could also include a contribution on African American Christianity, which has been, in David's estimation, quote, one of the most durable and inventive traditions in American religious history, with no real European counterpart of any major significance. And another might investigate the complex effects of Latino migration on American Catholicism. So what else might a second volume include? How might a sequel on comparative secularization carry forward the methodological advances that this first book has put forward? So David, I would be happy to hear your thoughts about these questions and to talk with all of you here about future directions for the study of religion. So thank you, Dean Hempton, for the remarkable works that have given us models for thinking big without losing sight of the specific, that have demonstrated how to experiment with diverse modes of inquiry and analysis in order to tell more nuanced stories, and that have pushed us to move beyond conventional boundaries in our studies of religion in and beyond the United States. Thank you.
Dave, if I close your computer, it's not going to blow up. Like Heather, I'd like to begin by thanking Charlie Stang for inviting me to be a respondent to this absolutely superb book, and to Ariella Ruth Goldberg for handling the logistics of the event. I should probably also confess, in the spirit of full disclosure, that I'm anything but impartial in my attitude toward the work produced by these two editors of this volume. Not only am I a big fan of the publications that they have produced individually and together, but I also view David Hempton as a very good friend. I'm confident that after this evening's discussion, I'm still going to feel that way. I hope David feels the same. Scholars who choose to tackle the issue of secularization face a daunting task. I can think of no subject in the field of modern history that is more fraught with controversy than secularization. There seems to be no agreement about what secularization is, whether, when, and where it has occurred, or what the salient factors have been in bringing it about. It's therefore little wonder that in 1965, the sociologist of religion David Martin proposed that, in his words, secularization should be erased from the sociological dictionary. For better or worse, though, scholars have refused to accept that proposal. And in fact, 13 years after issuing that proclamation, Martin published what was arguably his most important book, a work entitled A General Theory of Secularization. It's therefore gratifying that two historians as eminently qualified to think about the relationship between religion and modernity, as David Hempton and Hugh MacLeod, have entered the fray and have provided historians with a meaningful framework for further exploring the issue of secularization in the North Atlantic world. To provide those of you who haven't yet had the opportunity to read the book with a capsule summary, I would describe it as primarily an attempt to deal with secularization by focusing on what might fruitfully be viewed as secularization's antithetical twin, religiosity. Toward that end, they widely chose not to cover the waterfront, but instead focused on various forms of Christianity in the United States and Western Europe. The essays in the book tend to focus in one way or another on the question of religious innovation and the degree to which such innovation fosters religiosity. The volume then concludes with two synthetic pieces, one written by MacLeod and the other by Hempton, dealing with the salient points that have emerged from discussions of the comparative religiosity and, by extension, secularization of the United States and Europe. Unfortunately, time constraints preclude me from rehearsing the arguments of the individual essays. I do think, though, that in the interest of sparking discussion from you folks in the audience, I should say a few words about a few of the major themes that are treated in the concluding essays by Hugh MacLeod and David Hempton. Then, in the time that remains, I'd like to highlight what I see as the most important contribution this book makes to our understanding of religiosity, and then mention a couple of issues and questions that this seminal work has convinced me merit additional attention. Let me begin then with my consideration of the two concluding essays in the book. I should warn you at the outset, however, that in the interest of providing only a brief summary, I have egregiously oversimplified the carefully nuanced arguments that are advanced by both MacLeod and Hempton. In the first of those essays, Hugh MacLeod chooses to analyze the similarities and differences in the religious experience of the United States and Europe over time by dividing the period since 1790 into four periods. That analysis leads him to conclude that prior to about 1970, it would be appropriate to say that the United States was differently religious than Europe, but it would be more problematic to describe this nation as more religious than Europe. But beginning in the 1970s, MacLeod maintains, while the decline of religious practice, and perhaps also religious belief that took place in the United States and Europe alike during the 1960s continued to occur in Europe, the United States actually experienced an overall revival of interest in religion. In spite of the fact that the Protestant mainline continued to lose numbers and fewer Catholics were attending Mass, thanks especially to people who identified as conservative evangelicals, American religiosity held its own. MacLeod argues that it was during the 1970s that for the first time it would be legitimate to speak of what he terms a clear divide between a more religious America and a more secular Europe. David Hempton begins his concluding essay in the volume by describing both the value and the difficulties of engaging in a comparative history of phenomena as multifaceted as religiosity and secularization over a long, socially and intellectually complex period characterized by what he describes as nominally similar but culturally variant religious traditions. Then, after making the important observation that it's important to avoid exaggerating the speed and extent to which secularization has taken place in Europe, he provides readers with a statement of his major argument, an argument that's unfortunately impossible to elaborate in the detail that it deserves. Hempton maintains that the, and I'm quoting him here, differential trajectories of secularization in Western Europe and the United States are the result of what he calls an accumulation of small differences over time. In expanding on this point, he succeeds in providing readers with a cogent summary of many of the themes that are discussed in the volume as a whole. These themes include such closely linked factors as, quoting Hempton now, the separation of church and state, the democratization of Christianity and the role of free markets, the relationship between religion and political culture, the organizational characteristics of Christian congregations, the contrasting roles played by social elites and a correspondingly different relationship between religion and popular culture, the differential importance of evangelical Christianity, the impact of immigration, and the discourse of secularization itself. In discussing each of these factors, Hempton is careful to include a number of important qualifications and caveats, and you got a little bit of the flavor of this in David's talk. He concludes by expressing doubt that it's possible to translate the religious differences between Western Europe and the United States into a simplistic more or less. Both in its religiosity and in its secularization, he asserts, the United States may be distinctive, but is not exceptional from both other English-speaking countries and from Western Europe. In my judgment, the single most important lesson that emerges from these concluding essays, as well as the other essays in the volume, is that in evaluating the trajectories of religiosity and secularization in the North Atlantic world, it's necessary to engage in a very fine-grained analysis of both Western Europe and the United States. I'm not altogether sure that Hugh MacLeod's claim that it's possible to write a common religious history of the North Atlantic world is wrong, but as both MacLeod's own contribution and many of the other essays in the book eloquently demonstrate, it's vitally necessary in dealing with religiosity and secularization to take into account the contingencies associated with locale, region, and nation states, the differences between urban and rural experiences, and the differences in the fortunes of Protestantism and Catholicism. It's also important to consider not only special time-bound factors, such as the clerical abuse scandal within the Catholic Church and the rise of feminism in both Western Europe and the United States, but also more persistent factors affecting the status of religion within society and culture. Factors such as the revelations of the natural sciences, the human sciences, and history, and the role of potential competitors to religion for the loyalties and attention of people. Competitors such as politics and the numerous institutions associated with popular culture. My guess is that the kind of fine-grained analysis these considerations will entail will further complicate the problem of writing a comprehensive master narrative of the relative fortunes of religiosity and secularization in the North Atlantic world. Like every good book, this one suggests topics and issues that deserve additional attention from historians and other scholars. I'd like to mention a couple of these. The fact that secularization and religious innovation in the North Atlantic world focuses primarily on the trajectory and relative persistence of religiosity in Europe and the United States is certainly not a cause for criticism, because evaluating the status of the status of religiosity is an entirely appropriate way to grapple with the issue of secularization. That said, I also think that going forward, we need to devote additional attention to questions relating to the nature and history of the process of secularization. For better or worse, I think this means that we're going to have to become more creative in our efforts to define the meaning of secularization as it manifested itself on the ground, so to speak. We'll also need to broaden, I think, the way that we measure its existence. There are certainly empirically oriented markers that can be used in assessing religiosity and, by extension, secularization. The most obvious of these markers are church membership and church attendance, but other clearly measurable markers would include donations to religious causes, levels of religious literacy, and poll numbers concerning the extent of religiosity within different groups of people, though I take David's point that poll numbers are somewhat suspicious. Beyond these measurable markers, though, If we really want to understand the historical process of secularization, I'm convinced that we'll need to focus on variables that largely defy precise measurement. To elaborate what I mean by this, let me suggest that one way to approach the problem of secularization would be to evaluate the pervasiveness of religious categories and religious discourse within each of the various so-called cultural spaces within the societies of Europe and America. It would be appropriate, in my view, to designate those cultural spaces in which religion seems to be minimally present or altogether absent as secularized. But clearly, there are some cultural spaces in which the verdict is not altogether clear. In those cases, decisions will not be easily adjudicated. To cite just one example of what I have in mind, several of the essays in the book we're discussing made a point of emphasizing the success of evangelicals in appropriating the vehicles of popular culture for religious purposes. This seems to me to be a perfectly legitimate position. But to be honest, I'm much more struck by the degree to which most vehicles of mainstream popular culture virtually ignore religion altogether. The inference that I would draw from this is that popular culture as a whole is largely secular in nature, but I'm aware that not everyone would agree with this. The larger point that I'm making here is that if we really want to assess the extent to which secularization has occurred within a given place and time, these are the kinds of difficult and controversial issues that we'll need to address. A second issue that I think merits additional historical inquiry is the personal trajectory of those people who have become secularized, those people who are identified in polls and in several essays in this book as the nones. Thanks to the work of a number of scholars such as David Hempton and Hugh MacLeod, we already have a pretty good handle on the processes of disenchantment and secularization that took place within the North Atlantic intellectual community during the 19th and early 20th centuries. For the most part, however, we lack the kind of detailed studies that are necessary to understand how the secularization of rank-and-file Europeans and Americans actually worked on a day-to-day level. David Hempton makes a very promising observation in his essay that at least part of the explanation for the increase in non-religious folks may be what he calls weakening generational transmission. But that explanation, of course, demands additional analysis. What, for example, lay behind that weakening generational transition? David has given us one example in terms of interreligious marriage. And what other factors have been involved in leading to an increase in self-consciously secularized individuals? If we really want to grapple with the problem of secularization head-on, we'll need to devote a lot more attention than we have thus far to the question of why an increasingly large number of people have seemingly become less committed to religion over time, when and why that trend began, and the changing nature of the factors that are relevant in the trajectory or trajectories of secularization. Finally, I would suggest that we need to appreciate the degree to which factors that are often said to contribute to religiosity may well also contribute to the process of secularization. Let me provide two quick examples of what I have in mind. First, the increasingly therapeutic orientation of mainline Protestantism and even some strands of evangelicalism can legitimately be seen as a means of combating secularization. At the same time, however, it can also be interpreted as a manifestation of secularization. Second, as a number of essayists in the work I'm considering have noted, proponents of rational choice theory imply that the proliferation of religious choices, a predominantly American form of innovation, has been fundamental in retarding secularization. But it's worth pondering, I think, the possibility that the emergence of a multitude of new denominations and sects, coupled with a free market in religion, may have served to confuse a number of people, thereby leading those individuals to express indifference or even hostility to religion. In effect, those people responded to the competition among religious institutions in a free market by declaring a plague on all their houses. There's some suggestive evidence that this actually happened, not only in the Middle Colonies during the 18th century, but also in the burned-over district of New York in the early 19th century. I suspect that additional research would provide additional evidence for the reality of the scenario I've outlined. It's also worth noting in this context that after about the middle of the 19th century, the multitude of different religious institutions were not simply competing among themselves. Rather, in both Europe and the United States, those institutions also found themselves in competition with a plethora of vehicles of popular entertainment, political organizations, and other sources of potential demand on people's attention. Let me conclude this brief commentary by expressing my conviction that we all owe David Hempton and Hugh MacLeod a huge debt of gratitude for providing future scholars who are brazen enough to try to come to terms with the secularization thicket with many important guideposts and lessons. No less importantly, I think, the value of secularization and religious innovation goes well beyond the significant contributions that it makes to our understanding of religiosity and secularization. It's actually a book that merits the attention of all scholars interested in the history of religion in the North Atlantic world. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, John. Thank you, Heather. At this point, I'm going to ask the three of you to bring your seats up facing the audience. Jacob.
Yeah, thank you, Hempton. Thank you very much for the response. It's just an interesting book, and I look forward to reading it, particularly the kinds of lessons those of us who are working in Africa, Latin America, and Asia can learn from this, particularly given these global structures that you have presented. So my question relates to that. What is the implication of this to this study, given the fact that 2/3 of the Christendom are in Latin America, Africa, and Asia? In talking about this global Christianity, particularly located in Europe and America, how do we factor that into the interpretation and the theory that has really given this book a very fascinating shape for that I think will be very beneficial to our own students. I'm willing to, I think I'll probably recommend it to students who are doing African Christianity because it's so important. But is it possible to talk about this global Europe and America without, what is the implication for these 2/3 folks who turn to be Christians?
That's a great question, Jacob, and maybe linked to a question that Heather raised in her response, and that is, we more or less confined our analysis to Christianity in the North Atlantic world. So that religious tradition, that region, and those 200 years from the end of the 18th century to the present. Each one of those assumptions is contested. We should and probably could have expanded into other religious traditions as well. There are comments made about other religious traditions on the way in these essays, including mine, but there's not a sustained treatment of them. So that's one limitation. So another limitation is the North Atlantic world. Again, a book about secularization that claims some kind of transnational thrust probably should say more about the rest of the world. But these are the problems that we all know about in constructing a conference. When does it get beyond? To answer your question directly, as well as admitting the weaknesses of the book, I do think that old secularization paradigm about modernity, that Western Europe, then the United States, would be forerunners of secularization because they are advanced, technologically sophisticated, scientifically advanced countries, etc., and that sooner or later that those trajectories will happen right across other parts of the world as well as they modernize in those equivalent ways. So that's something to test. I mean, at the moment, it looks like the sheer power of Pentecostal forms of Christian expression, charismatic forms, healing forms, prosperity gospel forms, which are thriving in the parts of the world you mentioned. To what extent will they provide compelling cultural alternatives to the secularization model, and that they will simply keep generating the kind of religiosity that you're referring to? So in a way, the rest of the world, the analysis about this will be a bit of a test of that old secularization theory. Another way that, I mean, one of the narratives of secularization in the West is that certain kinds of religiosity were almost deliberately dampened down by a kind of institutional elite hold through theological colleges and seminary education, and so what happened in liberal Protestantism. I know a bunch of scholars of Pentecostalism in the United States, and people who are Pentecostal are nervous about what might happen if that pattern were to be reproduced in Pentecostalism, that you somehow educate a professional class of practitioners who lose touch with the real dynamism of their roots. So could that happen in a global perspective? What will happen, and this is a question, what will happen if the Pew survey is right, that by 2050, 4 out of every 10 Christians in the world will be African, and that Islam and Christianity will be the 2 fastest growing religious traditions in the world, even though Christianity will be shrinking in Western Europe and the United States. So there's going to be a big global change in patterns. As the non-affiliated are growing fast in the West, the Pew survey guesses that about 25 to 30% of Western Europeans and Americans will describe themselves as non-affiliated. And in other parts of the world, Christianity and Islam will be fast-growing traditions. So these are all going to be, I think, trends that historians of secularization are going to have to pay a lot of attention to. And people like, David Martin, who was mentioned here as maybe the most sophisticated theorist about secularization, followed that book up with a very sophisticated look at global Pentecostalism, and more or less admitting that he had underappreciated. In the same way that Harvey Cox wrote his Secular City, and then followed up with Tongues of Fire, as he himself confessed that he was looking at religion through the windows of Harvard Yard, not through the shanties of Sao Paulo or Lagos or whatever. So these are big questions. It's a tough question.
David, I feel as if I owe you an apology. I said you could have responded first to John and Heather, although you sort of did in this last answer. Is there anything you want to say before we jump to more questions?
Certainly not. No, I'll say just but in a way you're right that picked up exactly Heather's point about the limitations of what we did, which I think are real and serious, in terms of the scope of the book. John raised also one or two really important points that are worth pondering, and that is these tough analytical questions like, what is the process? How does it work? What are the engine drivers of secularization? And what is the meaning of secularization? It's a word that religious historians don't like using, but can't think of an alternative. And so it's one of those words that you're locked into a little bit because its umbrella is useful, but the word itself loses meaning, because the original meaning of the word is the secularization of church land, which is pretty obvious to work out. What acreages of Western Europe did the church own, and what acreages did they give up? And you could say, well, huge acreages were given up from the French Revolution onwards. But once you get into these other ways these cultural ways of thinking about it, that gets extremely complicated. And John's point about how to think about cultural spaces and religion within those cultural spaces that aren't churches. In other words, the social salience of religion in those spaces outside Sunday morning. It's extremely complicated work because lots of people have done this phenomenally interesting work about, popular culture may indeed be deeply secular, but many of our TV shows and so on have very deep kind of religious motifs running through them, even though they have, a first up appearance of not having much to do with it.
I think I'd say some. I'm
Okay.
really struck that not many do, but
Right.
we may just have to agree to disagree about that.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. It's a complex issue, really very difficult to adjudicate.
Yeah, but those are the kind of questions that some of the essays gets into a little bit, and do feel free, those of you who also contributed to this volume. There's no hiding place now, really. If there were things that were said, because these were really great. The thing that was great about it is that I think the essays themselves were all fantastic. There's no weak links in the book, and it's one of those books that I think that does reward a close reading of the individual essays themselves.
Other questions? Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
I was wondering if I was fascinated by the talk about how the faith often doesn't get translated to the next generation. And I went to a public high school, but I also went to a private boarding school where they had chapels. And I was asked to teach ethics at a major university, and I taught at Calvin College. And I ran to the voluntary chapels because I was teaching in the secular world and was shocked that they made it voluntary where it used to be mandatory. And then I read George Marsden's book on the loss of the soul of the university, in which he talks about the dismantling of the chapels, in which I've done research about all these boarding schools we have in New England, and a lot of them formerly were church-based, and now a lot of them aren't, and sometimes they talk about religion, sometimes they talk about Harry Potter, and and then I found that when I was being evaluated at Calvin College, I would be evaluated for how Christian my course was. But then in the secular world, there's PC-ness, and in the seminaries there's TC-ness, and so I ran to monasteries recently, even here in Cambridge, to try to seek my sacrality, in which the whole modus operandi was to be like a monk, and then I found that it was very difficult to make that connection between the sacred and the secular. Can you please comment on that?
There's a lot of ideas in there, but it started really with generational transmission and how it works, and I do think there's an important story here. I mean, certainly there's a big article by Mark Chavez and is it David Boas on looking at as much data as they can gather from the 1920s right to now. And it does look as if generational transmission has weakened throughout that period. People who were once very good at this, Methodists, Baptists, those populist evangelical groups, are now much less good at that. The evangelical tradition, there's been a big gap now. People under 30 have very different political, social values, church attendance records of those over 35. So something is really happening there in the generational transmission. What is causing it? You know, part of it is mixed marriage and less insistence of parents on generational transmission of religion, opening it up rather as a freedom of choice issue for teenage and young adult children. Some of it has to do with the weakening of the institutions that you're talking about and these kind of chapels and so on. But one big difference between, you know, Western Europe, I think, and the United States is that there's still a reasonably vibrant tradition of private religious higher education institutions in the United States, which do not exist in the same way as they do in Europe. I mean, for example, some of the colleges you mentioned, Calvin or Wheaton College in Illinois, or a whole bunch of other evangelical colleges, Gordon College in this area, are still doing somewhat better than the more mainline liberal Protestant traditions at generational transmission and institutional transmission. But there too, I mean, as I've said earlier, with the you know the above and under 35s, there's a change taking place in front of our very eyes. I don't know if you folks have other things to add to that.
No, I think you're right on the money.
Other comments, questions?
So you folks are working hard on the nouns. Tell us what you're discovering. And
Okay, I didn't know these chairs would move.
Oh, goodness. Well, thanks in large part to Dean Hempton's leadership, Casper and I get to sit over in Divinity Hall and work with leaders of communities around the country who are doing the work of religious innovation. And we came to that by first looking at the trend of religious disaffiliation and asking, with a kind of implicit notion that they couldn't all just be non-belongers, where were these folks going to experience meaning, to experience transformation, if not within a traditional congregational or denominational context? And so that brought us into an exploration of everything from CrossFit and fitness communities to maker spaces and, you know, these other nominally secular type of spots, to these innovative forms of community that did maintain a religious lens. So whether that's an online sangha or these dinner churches around the country or what have you. So with that as a frame, I guess I would say two things that have become very clear lately, and please build upon these. One is that these community leaders, whether they self-identify as religious or not, and whether their communities self-identify as religious or not, are being asked to play the role of pastors, essentially. They are being called upon to serve their communities, much like someone in an authorized religious role would be called upon to serve, because oftentimes people have nowhere else to go. And so that has been a surprise for us. We went from mapping this landscape to being in a position of serving or attempting to serve these leaders who want to deepen their own wells so that they can contribute to the spiritual growth and transformation of the people in their care. So that has been a big impetus for us to gather them and to try to develop resources to support their work. And
So as you think about that,
Yeah.
do you think that secularization is a useful word, or what other word is a more interesting word or useful word to describe what you're seeing in front of your very eyes? Because in a way you could argue it both ways, right?
Yeah, I think that's the most unsatisfying thing about the language question, is that it feels more like religion has gone underground and is still happening, but in non-religious spaces. And the disaffiliation is really about a unwillingness to be labeled and to carry somehow or represent something that is far bigger than me out in the public world. And so, yeah, I think that's what's difficult with the secularization language, is it doesn't grasp that, you know, the soul cycle instructor who's asked to officiate a wedding, or, you know, people who are asked, you know, We just on the phone a couple of days ago, someone was like, yeah, someone's texting me on a Sunday morning asking if they should get a divorce. And like, what do I say to that, you know? And they have no pastoral training in any way. So I think that religious activity is still happening. So that's a challenge with language.
Yeah, for me, that raised the question that I had in listening. In other words, what's religious and what's secular?
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Is the prosperity gospel an example of the secularization of Christianity? Because Christianity is serving a secular function of getting money. If one goes to a yoga class and they want to talk about meditation and they want to talk about mindfulness, you know, is that a secularization, or is that really people looking for a form of religiosity that isn't quite bound up with traditional Christian forms of religiosity? So it becomes very clear which is secular and which is religious.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right, and that's why, you know, someone like Brian Wilson would argue that you know, a big component of what he considers American secularization is really the secularization of religion itself in these churches. You know that you know, this is a different set of forms of religious expression than would have been, but you know, so he would argue that that's a distinctive form of American Christianity. It becomes, or American religion more generally, it becomes ever more morphing into, you know, these kinds of areas where it's very difficult to say what, you know. So are the people that are doing your leadership of nuns, are these agents of secularization, or are they subversive agents of spiritual meaning to disinherited religious communities? And it's probably both at the same time. It's really, it is a complicated. So Janet?
Well, just to say that just because it's so complicated doesn't mean that we should abandon the terms necessarily, and sometimes this kind of ideal terms which never are fully realized one way or the other, nonetheless it helps you to make certain important distinctions. I mean, that's just like an obvious point. It doesn't mean necessarily that the term secular is not useful. Of course, we have to define what that means. The one thing I was also just going to add to Jacob's question is, because I'm someone who's worked in other times and other cultures, but taking up some of these very issues about modernity and secularization, and you know, once you start looking at the global picture, once you're looking at Asia in particular, it gets so complicated and it flips so many times. But nonetheless, the fact that this kind of project, you know, focused on a particular time and place, and you know, sort of salient examples of what we mean by secularization, that it's a really good thing that you did focus that well, because certain very basic sort of, you know, variables and themes then can be usefully, you know, put to the test in other contexts. And I think to have a larger kind of volume on all, then it's just going to be a mishmash of stuff, and it's just at this point.
No, I think that's helpful. I mean, we did you know, face up to that very issue, because there has been some really terrific work done on more global secularizations, and you know, we just took a decision at the time that we had to have some geographical you know, boundaries around it to make it work. But I still and of course there will be some criticisms of this volume, that even treating the spaces we did, I mean, there's you American historians out there know that there's a big body of work really carving the United States into many different regions to think of religion. You know, that New England doesn't look like the Deep South, it doesn't look like the Pacific Northwest, it doesn't look like Appalachia, whatever it might happen to be. And similarly, trajectories in Europe, France is a very different trajectory than Ireland, for example, or Germany. So even the big kind of regional portions we looked at are themselves probably, you could argue, too big for a meaningful comparison. So this is really the trouble with really big picture history, really, that, you know, it's very difficult to do it with the kind of fine-grained analysis that you that John was saying we really deeply need in this. So it is a challenge. But I do think that anything, I think strongly believe now that the historical tribes are now too centered on national traditions. You know, and certainly the worlds that I operate, very little connection. Like when we were thinking of who could be really good comparative historians across the Atlantic, you know, that really you could name them comfortably in one hand, in truth. Bill, you were about to say something.
No, I just asked earlier whether in North American and Northern European studies of secularization, whether the issue of modernity is itself a conflicting and confusing part of the problem, because certainly in the Middle Eastern world, and I think further east as well through Asia, a lot of the original work done on modernization very quickly morphed into secularization being the assumption, because it was the assumption that it was the secularizing West that was therefore becoming the norm for modernization. And now that modernization has been, I think, questioned on almost every Asian front on the Western model, that now the two, turn out to have fed some of the same problems in the non-Western world. So I don't know whether this is now an issue in the North Atlantic world or not in terms of historiography.
Yeah. So one of the big questions, the thing with all of these terms is how low dangerous they are. I mean, if secularization is a difficult word, modernization is a very difficult word, because one person's modernity is another person's something else. So for example, the evangelical tradition in the United States is a classic example that in some respects is very anti-modern in its opposition to evolutionary biology and climate change and scientific knowledge and a whole range of things. But in many other ways is really fantastically modern in its appropriation of technology and sophisticated communication networks and transmission mechanisms. I mean, often these mega churches that Kip has been working on, I hope he hasn't left, are phenomenally modern in their technological sophistication and their transmission of messages and so on, but often have disturbingly what we might think is anti-modern views of science or whatever. So it's so modernity itself, and of course there are people like Eisenstadt arguing for multiple modernities, that there's different kinds of modernities and different kinds of cultural settings. When I was a graduate student, modernity really did look like urbanization, technical sophistication, et cetera, but all of those are now contested territories. Because Hugh MacLeod did a very fine project on testing, is the real variable here urbanization? So he looked at 3 of the largest cities in the world in 1900, Berlin, New York, and London, and found that even though they were roughly similar in size and population, their religious trajectories were dramatically different. Berlin was astonishingly secular by 1900. London was somewhere in the middle, and New York was really quite strongly religious in terms of any measurement, through immigration. So that even in those 3 mega cities, there was huge differences in their religious populations of them, owing to different factors producing different kinds of modernity. So, was Berlin more modern because its intelligentsia had persuaded its working classes that religion was roughly bunkum much earlier than anywhere else and taught them to organize themselves politically? Or is New York more modern because it was able to sustain a hugely cosmopolitan, pluralistic set of religious transactions in its different neighborhoods? And it depends on what you call modern, I guess.
I wanted to ask about another lens, and I haven't read the book, so I don't know if it's discussed. But just like Christianity obviously isn't the perfect stand-in for religion, also Western Europe isn't a perfect standard for Europe.
Yes.
And I understand your context of the book, and you're focusing on the North Atlantic. It makes sense. It has better comparative value. But as a Romanian, thinking of Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, we see the sort of like a desecularization. It's like the trend is in a different direction. And religion is, maybe it's used politically too, as a tool. So I'm thinking perhaps another lens is to look at the relationship with politics, and whether maybe Western Europe perhaps is an exceptionally liberal society, whereas the US is more conservative and hence less secular, because it seems like there's a strong relationship between body politic and religion, and conservatism versus liberalism, and maybe liberalism can be another way to look at it, like modernity. And is that something that could shed some light?
I do think that, well, there are 2 points that you make that are really important. You're absolutely right that we did not deal with Eastern Europe, and that would tell a different story. The second point about political culture, what I might call the national project, I think is really vital, because even in those parts of Western Europe where religion was used as an ally for a national project, as it was in Poland or in Ireland, as a defense against imperial control mechanisms. Secularization is much delayed. I mean, though it is happening now in Ireland and Poland, but especially in Ireland. And historians argue that the national project in the United States is separation of church and state, the democratization of religious traditions, free market in religion, and so on, and so on, and so on. You see, this rational choice stuff and so on. And I think there's some truth in that, I mean, if you look at the different political trajectories of France and the United States, for example, the revolution and the very high levels of anti-clericalism in the 19th century doesn't have an American correspondence, really. I mean, there's some anti-elite clericalism in the United States around the Great Awakening, these kind of comfy and overpaid Presbyterians and Congregationalists compared with these, frontier traveling Baptists and Methodists and so on. But in truth, there's much less anti-clericalism, and there's much less of anti-clerical labor political movements in the United States than there is in Western Europe. And then the point you make is absolutely right, that there, in places like Czechoslovakia and the places Europe that there are all kinds of desecularizing things going on right now and that's also true of some parts of the old Soviet Union. So it's so that's why teleology and overblown theory is a dangerous thing in this. I think there is I think a need for some fine-grained historical analysis of a topic like this, because it's easy to get carried away with a convenient theoretical formulation around modernity or whatever, which is not really going to help very much. I don't think, anyway.
David, I promised that I would end this in time that you can get across the street. So I know that there are more questions, and I'm sorry that we have to cut it short, but let's take this opportunity to thank David and our two respondents.